Why is fluency? Why sentences in English? 30 useful sentences in English. I prefer. I prefer reading than watching TV. I prefer reading than watching TV. I prefer running than walking. I prefer running than walking. I prefer coffee than tea. I prefer coffee than tea. I prefer swimming than jogging. I prefer swimming than jogging. I prefer cooking than eating out. I prefer cooking than eating out. I prefer painting than drawing. I prefer painting than drawing. I prefer cycling than driving. I prefer cycling than driving. I prefer listening than talking. I prefer listening than talking. I prefer dancing than singing. I prefer dancing than singing. I prefer texting than calling. I prefer texting than calling. I prefer hiking than camping. I prefer hiking than camping. I prefer baking than frying. I prefer baking than frying. I prefer studying than partying. I prefer studying than partying. I prefer shopping than browsing. I prefer shopping than browsing. I prefer traveling than staying home. I prefer traveling than staying home. I prefer cleaning than organizing. I prefer cleaning than organizing. I prefer writing than typing. I prefer writing than typing. I prefer playing than working. I prefer playing than working. I prefer resting than exercising. I prefer resting than exercising. I prefer laughing than crying. I prefer laughing than crying. I prefer watching movies than reading books. I prefer watching movies than reading books. I prefer meditating than stressing. I prefer meditating than stressing. I prefer skiing than snowboarding. I prefer skiing than snowboarding. I prefer fishing than hunting. I prefer fishing than hunting. I prefer gardening than decorating. I prefer gardening than decorating. I prefer knitting than sewing. I prefer knitting than sewing. I prefer gaming than socializing. I prefer gaming than socializing. I prefer photographing than painting. I prefer photographing than painting. I prefer running errands than staying idle. I prefer running errands than staying idle. I prefer teaching than learning. I prefer teaching than learning. Hope you have enjoyed this video. For more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe.